All right, so we have Brigid Beaubien with us. I'd like to announce her. She is the Associate Professor and Graduate Coordinator for Early Childhood Education, Teacher Education at Eastern Michigan University. Dr. Beaubien teaches courses in elementary social studies methods, early childhood education, and urban education. Her research has also focused on those areas in addition to the history of education. She has received a number of awards for teaching excellence since joining EMU. And Dr. Beaubien's research has been published in journals such as Young Children's Social Education and the Journal of Research of Childhood Education. She has presented at over 50 national conferences and countless statewide conferences. Dr. Beaubien was a teacher in Detroit Public Schools and an administrator in Plymouth Canton Community Schools prior to coming to EMU. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brigid Beaubien. Brigid, we'd now like you to turn control of the screen to you, so you will now be able to share all of your slides with us.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So before I get started, I want to do just a real brief kind of explanation of how I came to this topic. So I was a Detroit public school teacher for many years, both in kindergarten and in social studies in 4th grade, and I'd graduated from Eastern with my teaching certificate with a dual major in social studies and early childhood education. And I knew tons about early childhood, but I knew only the most basic information about history and social studies, the things we all learn, right? The things that really aren't necessarily accurate as we look at it more and more. And when I was teaching 4th grade social studies, I came upon a book called So You Want Women to Vote, Lizzie Stanton. And of course, I was very familiar with Susan B. Anthony and the women's history movement, or the women's suffrage movement through her lens, but I didn't know anything about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So I read the book and I thought, why am I missing this material? Why do I, as someone who graduated from university with a major in social studies, am missing so much knowledge and have so many holes in my background? And so that really began my study of women's history, and I earned my PhD at Wayne State University, and I actually studied how women philosophers looked at education through the history of the United States. And what I found is that women who really studied these things, and democracy and citizenship, oftentimes were not written in the history books, but had strong connections to both first the abolitionist movement and then the women's movement. So that's kind of what precipitated all of this. This presentation is a course I teach. And so what I'm condensing down into a half an hour is something that normally takes 3 hours a week for 15 weeks. So we're going really fast here. If you have questions, I try and keep an eye on the chat. I'm trying to share my screen here. So let me see if I can do this. Is my screen showing?
Not yet, Brigid, and if it's not able to, I can always pull it up in the background too. So are you seeing the share screen button at the bottom?
Let me hold on a second. Oh, yeah, I thought I'd hit that. Are you seeing it now?
Not yet. So let me, if it's okay, I'll do a screen share for you.
Okay, that would be great.
All right, and thank you so much. And I'll just remind everyone too, if you're just arriving, we're asking all of our participants to just mute their video if you can, and we'll be having an opportunity to show video a little bit later on, and then we'll also do some Q&A a little bit later on as well. So we'll just remind you, if you're just joining, if you could please mute your video, and I'm just gonna do a quick screen share here, Brigid, and then just let me know when you'd like me to advance the slides, and I'll do so for you.
Great, I appreciate that so much. Thank you. You can go ahead and start to the next one. So the women's history movement, the women's suffrage movement, women's rights, isn't something that just suddenly appeared. It was always part of the United States history. The founding mothers were very concerned that the founding fathers weren't including women in the Constitution. It was an ongoing issue, and it was at this point where we really begin to see the intersection of the abolitionist movement and women's rights, because as some components of the founding fathers were arguing against slavery, some were arguing for the rights of women and the rights of slaves. So we're going to be seeing some intersectionality here as we go through the whole presentation. But the first actual piece of women's history that we see recorded in a primary document that we're aware of is this quote by Abigail Adams to her husband in 1776. And it says, remember the ladies, if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. And so there is a lot of undocumented research available if anyone's looking for a PhD topic on what women were doing at the time of the revolution that were really laying the groundwork for the women's rights movement in this country. So it's kind of a field that hasn't been studied, and it's got some really rich content that can be looked at. And that's where this all starts. Can you move the slide? Thank you. The second piece that really kind of pushed women's rights forward in the United States was the founding of the Troy Female Seminary. And that was established in Troy, New York in 1821. And what made this really unique was that for the very first time, they provided women with the same education as men. So instead of just doing like a finishing school where you would learn to be a good hostess and embroider and learn some French and maybe some basic reading skills, this college actually really encouraged the understanding of philosophy and physics and science and math, all the things that men were getting in their colleges. One of their most notable graduates at this time was a woman that I just mentioned a little bit ago by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Can you scroll the screen? Thank you. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born in upstate New York and is really considered the mother of the women's rights movement in the United States. So when she was born to a family of all girls and one boy who died when he was a teenager. And one of the things her father kept saying to her was, I really wish you were a boy. And that drove a lot of what she did throughout her life and really pushed her to create as many legal changes as she could in her lifetime. She really is the foundation of the women's rights movement in a way that Susan B. Anthony wasn't. We're going to talk about that in just a second. She radically eloped to get married to England to go to an abolitionist conference with her new husband. And it was at the abolitionist conference that she met Lucretia Mott, who is the picture here on the left. And the two of them were both passionate about being abolitionists, but they started making these connections that, we're talking about people's rights, but women have none. And so it was at that point they decided that they were going to hold the first women's rights convention in the United States. So when they came back to the country, they organized the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York on July 19th and 20th of 1848. And they wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which was based on the Constitution. It looked almost just like the Constitution, but it changed a lot of the terminology to either be gender neutral or pro-women as well. And so that was really where we began the women's rights movement. It's important to note that all of the women that you see listed in attendance were also abolitionists. So abolitionists really founded the foundation of the women's rights movement. And they're tied together as we go through this whole thing. Can you scroll the screen? So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's on the left, and Susan B. Anthony on the right, really were the mothers of the civil rights, or the women's rights movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was married and she had children. She had many children, actually. And Susan B. Anthony, like many feminists of her time, decided not to get married because if she got married, she would lose all rights to her property and would not be able to actually own her own money. So she chose never to marry. The two of them were partners through their entire life, except to the very end, where they had a big falling out. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the words. She did the writing, she did the speeches. She was really the philosopher and the thinker behind it. And Susan B. Anthony was the feet, the boots on the ground. She was the one that traveled the country giving the speeches that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote. And so together they made a really great team, each doing what the other one couldn't and moving women's rights forward. All right, next screen. So the women's rights movement, as I've said a couple times, is very connected to the abolitionist movement. And so along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass was probably one of the foremost advocates for women's rights, as he was also fighting as an abolitionist. And Sojourner Truth, who actually is buried, if you're in Michigan right now, she's actually buried in Battle Creek. She was an incredible lyceum speaker. She'd go on these tours. Think of the tours kind of like a big concert in our day, where they would go and they would actually talk, and it would be the entertainment of the weekend. And she was considered to be one of the most popular speakers on the Lyceum tour. And she would talk about women's rights, Black rights. She would be really advocating for legal changes. She was the first Black woman to be able to actually win a lawsuit in the United States. And she's most famous for a speech called "Ain't I a Woman?", where she talks about her needs for basic rights. So they were very much involved at the same time as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. So the connections continued really through the Civil War, or really to the Civil War. And at the Civil War, the women's rights movement really took a back seat to the abolitionist movement. So you didn't even see really people in the forefront like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony doing a lot of promoting or pushing women's rights. Once the Civil War was over, they picked back up their cause really quickly. And in 1866, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, I want to make sure I get the title right, founded the American Equal Rights Association and began publishing a newspaper called The Revolution, which is the picture there on the right. It was a pretty radical paper for that time. Can you turn to the next slide? Thank you. And so things moved along pretty quickly. My slide is a little short, so I'm not sure if yours is, so I'll read them for you. They established the American Equal Rights Association. In 1869, they became the party, the Women's Rights Party, became really disconnected because they were fighting along two tracks. One part of the movement really wanted the 14th and 15th Amendment, which established voting rights for Black men. They felt that men should have the vote before women, and that made logical sense. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony felt that women should be included equally. At certain times, they felt that white women should be included equally, but most of the time they felt that women and Black men should be included equally, until they got pushed into the corner at the very end in late 1869, early 1870s. And they ended up separating, the organization separated, fractured into two, one that really supported the 14th and 15th Amendment, and then Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton becoming far more radical and saying, no, white women needed the right to vote. And needed to be included in a separate, what they hoped to be a 16th Amendment, which didn't turn out to be the case. In 1872, both Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth attempted to vote in the presidential election. We always hear about Susan B. Anthony and her being put into jail, but actually Sojourner Truth did it as well. And so it's important that we recognize that they both did that at the same time. Right? Can you turn to the next slide? So as they went through their lives, they again were partners until the very end. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton became profoundly radical. She wrote a publication called The Women's Bible, where she took out any part that sounded patriarchal or sounded like men's rights or that men could oppress women and turned it into gender neutral statements or female positive statements, and often referred to God as a female. And so that could be seen as radical today. So you can imagine what it was when she did it in 1895. And it was at that point that Susan B. Anthony kind of just said, you know, I've had enough of this. And she and Elizabeth Cady Stanton separated. And Susan B. Anthony was really glorified as the leader of the movement and had a lot of young girls really fawning over her and supporting her and thinking that she was the be all and end all. And this created a lot of consternation with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was like, hey, I did everything she did and probably a little more. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton became increasingly angry and continued to write. And a little known fact is she, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was the most published person in the entire world between 1898 and 1902, and yet so many women today don't even know her name, which I think is just kind of an interesting little fact there. So if you can move the slide. So that was the initial guard voting for women's suffrage. The next guard kind of bridged, there was Carrie Chapman Chapman Katz and Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughters. They were really the bridge between the old guard and what became the new guard, which was kind of run by a woman by the name of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Both of them were Oxford graduates, and they had both learned suffrage tactics and marketing ploys in England while they were there at the university. And after Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies in 1902, and Susan B. Anthony a little bit later, 1908, I believe, they start really talking about how are we going to market women's suffrage. And so you start seeing things like the postcard and note paper that is there on the left side of the screen. You see buttons like the Votes for Women button that you see in the bottom right screen. And then the top piece of jewelry is actually suffrage jewelry. And a piece of suffrage jewelry always had an amethyst, a peridot, and seed pearls, and each represented a piece of the movement. So they became very astute at marketing their political movement. Okay, can you turn to the next slide? And a lot of what we see in today's protesting in all different venues actually got its roots in the women's rights movement. So in 1913, Alice Paul decided that what was going to be best for the organization was to hold a suffrage parade at Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And she felt that that would really promote the cause, and it would push him into a corner where he had to pretty much allow women to vote. It didn't quite work out that way. Let me kind of point out a few pictures. The bottom left is a picture of the parade. Actually, all the pictures on the left are pictures of the parade. The bottom right is a woman by the name of Ines Mullard, and she rode a white horse with this flowing white gown and a beautiful crown for women's suffrage, and she was considered Lady Suffrage. After the parade, she went on a tour across the United States, speaking on behalf of the rights for women to vote. And she died. She actually had cancer and died on the trail. But what they said she did was be a martyr for the cause. So there was a martyr for suffrage, and this was a theme that actually helped push us across the finish line because she kind of laid that foundation. At the parade, again, the 1913 Woodrow Wilson Suffrage Parade, it's important to know that this is the first time that Black women took a really active role. And Deltas, the very famous Black sorority, this was their first public event as a group. They marched in the suffrage parade, even though Alice Paul and Lucy Burns asked them not to, because they felt that it was going to take away from the cause of suffrage if Black women were included in it. They still went ahead and marched, and that's a representational picture up on the top right. Black women were very much involved in women's suffrage, but the white women would sell them out every single time. They would keep saying publicly that if women got the right to vote, we knew that we could continue. I'm trying to find the exact quote here. They literally said white supremacy won't be endangered if women got the right to vote, because they could make sure African American women did not have that right. All right, if you can turn to the next slide. So one of the things that the women started doing shortly before the beginning of World War I is they began standing in front of the White House because the president wouldn't allow women's suffrage. He said, like, basically, it's not your time, you need to wait. And so they began standing outside the White House as sentinels with signs. And that's what you're seeing on this blurry picture. I'm sorry, I couldn't find a better one. World War I then started, and Woodrow Wilson was talking a lot about the Kaiser and how much he was not the Kaiser was not allowing democracy. And so the women began to continue to stand in front of the White House with their picket signs, but this time it was all the words of the president. And it was publicly humiliating for the president, who was seen across the world with all of these signs that were basically using his own words against him. So he told the district attorney in the state in Washington, D.C. that he had to do something with these women. And so the women began to be thrown into jail and tried. And what they were tried for was disturbing traffic, if you can believe it. And they were given a $5 fine, which they refused to pay. And they were all thrown into the Algonquin jail. And they were tortured there, they were force fed, and they were basically, because they went on a hunger strike, which caused the force feeding. And because of the hunger strike, the president became really concerned that he would have more martyrs on his hands, much like Innes Mueller right after his parade. So in a very dramatic moment, one of the women that were thrown into jail happened to be a senator's wife who was permitted in to talk to her. And she slipped into his pocket a note that said all of the things that had happened to the women, the abuse, the force feeding. And he took that and he gave it to the newspapers. And so the knowledge of what was being done in the Algonquin jail became public, and the president was shamed and embarrassed into basically putting himself in the position where he had to support women's suffrage. If you can turn to the next slide. So he promotes women's suffrage, says that it's needed for the war effort, and the 19th Amendment is passed by Congress on June 14th, 1919. And it takes 35 states to ratify it. And it took a little over 14 months for it to move through all of the states. They were pretty sure they could do it until Delaware, which had been a Democratic stronghold, actually voted against women's suffrage. So at the very end, the only state left was the state of Tennessee, and it was a Republican stronghold. They didn't think they'd be able to do it. And the night before the vote, one of the young Congress people for the house in Tennessee got a note from his mother, and I'm not exaggerating here, it literally said, please do right and think of the women and vote for suffrage. And he had been an anti-suffrage voter, and so that meant he had a red rose. And that morning of the vote, he came in with a yellow rose, which meant that he supported women's suffrage. And so unexpectedly, it passed in Tennessee, and women earned the right to vote literally just barely over 100 years ago this year. So if you can turn to the next slide. So that was considered the end of the first wave of women's suffrage. The first wave was very much about women's legal rights. The next phase was more about not their legal rights, but their lives, what was going on day to day. And it was why Alice Paul and Lucy Burns continued to fight for the ERA. We had, a world of depression, a world war, the 1950s, things were moving along. Most women weren't concerned with feminism and women's rights until African Americans began to really fight for civil rights. And again, we see an intersection of civil rights, I know she's one of my favorites, civil rights and women's rights kind of together. So women began talking about creating an organization that would model themselves after the NAACP and wanting to really begin to create a movement and take stands like the civil rights movement was. And so we see a lot of this going on. So Fannie Lou Hammer on the left was very much involved in Freedom Summer and Freedom Schools, and is really about voting rights and democracy and citizenship. There's some wonderful books on her, and her story is really impressive. The white women began to model themselves after what she was doing and a lot of the movement that she was looking at. And so they created, I'm trying to think of the name of it at this moment. The name escapes me at the moment. So that was happening at the same time that Betty Friedan's book came out. And Betty Friedan's book was called The Feminist Mystique. The organization was called the National Organization for Women. And it had 6 measures that they wanted to enact. They wanted laws that would ban employment discrimination. They wanted maternity leave and care guaranteed. They wanted guaranteed child care. They wanted tax credits for child care. They wanted equal and unsegregated education and equal job training for poor women. So that was what they were focused on. And then they began to really focus on the Equal Rights Amendment. So they began fighting for the ERA. They too split into 2 groups, a more radical group that was looking to push the ERA and a more traditional group that really wanted to fight for those 6 measures through the National Organization of Women. When the ERA passed Congress in 1972 and went to the states to be ratified, we needed 38 states in 10 years to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. And we have fallen 3 states short. So we still don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. So as the Equal Rights Amendment kind of pittered out, that through the 70s, that ended the second wave of feminism. If you can turn to the next slide. The third wave of feminism was in the mid-90s, and it was kind of run by Generation X. And they wanted to reclaim certain parts of womanhood that they felt the first 2 waves had taken away from them. And so the third wave really focused on empowerment and female empowerment and taking back your sexuality and using it for yourself. And then the fourth wave of feminism began in 2012, and it's what we're still really in the middle of. We don't know how it's going to end yet. And it was really pushed by the Me Too movement. I've got a picture here from the Women's March, and it was pushed by the absolutely dismal statistics, which I'm sure you're all aware of women and what we earn and where we fall within leadership positions. And it's being played out literally as we're watching. So it will be really interesting to see kind of how retrospectively this wave of feminism ends. All right, so what questions can I answer?